Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
Is it real? The design of online games have reached a new level of sophistication, appealing to lots of people. According to the World Health Organization, a new disease has occurred as a result. It's called gaming disorder. It's defined as, quote, a pattern of behavior characterized by impaired control over gaming, with increasing priority given to gaming over other activities, end quote. And it says it comes after the development of treatment programs. But what does the disease really mean? And how can it actually be treated? Today on Talk to Al Jazeera, a conversation with Dr. Richard Graham, a psychiatrist who treats people addicted to online games.
Dr. Graham, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera. Can you start by describing what happens inside the brain, the kind of mental chemical process that goes on when you are immersed in a video game?
What happens when we're immersed in a video game is that the brain starts to activate the sort of exciting reward systems, neurological pathways that are associated with excitement and pleasurable activities. And of course, it makes us want to keep doing that more and more. And so game designers and perhaps social media platforms have learnt how to activate those systems to keep us in-game and on-screen for as long as possible.
And obviously your cases are confidential, but just give us some idea of the patients that you treat and how they are affected by excessive gaming or just obsessive behavior with technology.
The most common type of problem that I find in my work is when usually a parent, sometimes a school, makes contact when a young man, usually around 14 to 15 years, is starting to attend school less and perhaps do less well in their subjects. They've often, prior to that point, been very able, and on the whole, I find in my work that most of the young people I work with are extremely bright, and often with quite a good few arguments to bring to their appointments too about why I'm wrong. But it's that sort of concern that starts to sort of kick in around the mid-teens, where of course we're also seeing that time in life where perhaps for the first time you're going to be assessed with, say, GCSE exams and then later A-levels in a much more public way. And we know from other studies that young people are feeling really stressed by school. And one of the ways they cope is through technology, but of course that can become a really sort of unhelpfully positive escape. That means they keep going back to it when perhaps attending to some of the offline challenges would also be helpful.
But doesn't that show that gaming isn't perhaps an addiction or disorder in and of itself, that it is a coping mechanism used to deal with an underlying problem, whether it be depression or anxiety or stress over something else that might be happening in life?
There are lots of ways that we can start to do something that, in a sense, originally is a coping strategy to help with what might be the ordinary pressures of life, sometimes more extreme, maybe bullying or family pressures, conflict between parents. There can be all sorts of reasons. But then I think where we start to move into the territory of addiction is what might have at one point been almost a healthy way of trying to cope with some stresses starts to have a grip of its own. And that person is no longer able to have quite the control over their use, that they feel compelled to keep increasing the amount of whatever it is, again, a substance or gaming.
So this is about the loss of control.
The loss of control is absolutely key to an addiction, but also when they do try to stop, they do get that withdrawal reaction, which is quite hard to understand from a behavior, but it's very real for any games addict or gambling addict, that they just feel so terrible when they try to stop that it kind of nudges them again to go back to where they were before.
You're mentioning drugs and alcohol there, but those are very different types of addictions, aren't they? With gaming, it's it's something that is based around an activity. It's not as though you are injecting anything. It's not as though you are drinking any toxic substances.
I think it's really important to remember that when we do ingest a drug or take some alcohol, that is modifying our brain chemistry. And there are behaviours that will also modify brain chemistry. Somebody might go for a long run because they release endorphins, the sort of stress hormones that again can give a bit of a high, some euphoric feelings that make them want to keep going. Now there's nothing injected during that, but the impact on the brain may not be so different from somebody who is using drugs. So we have to remember that all processes, whether it's something you do or something you take, will have some impact on brain chemistry.
Is it just about environment or a particular set of circumstances in life, or might there also be a biological underpinning to the sort of person that might be more susceptible to extreme behaviour?
I think we can certainly see that there might be certain personality characteristics. Somebody who's more impulsive might struggle to control themselves more than others. But I have to say in my work, I have yet to see such clear personality profiles that might have a genetic basis to them that I can say definitely predispose someone to an addiction.
But then what about the other factors at play? Because of course it is the job of software developers, game makers, to keep you hooked on what it is that they are producing. How do they seduce the player into staying with it?
Yeah, I think if I knew all the mechanisms that would keep people in game, I could probably make more money than I do as a psychiatrist. However, there are some fundamental things. The sort of principle of persuasive design is, I think, both unhelpful for the digital economy in the long term, because it's a sort of race to get people more and more on screen to the point where it will affect everyone's health and well-being, to just simple factors like a game that you're not allowed to pause and save where you've got to. You know, for young people, it's incredibly distressing to get to a certain point in a game and then their parents say it's time to eat, and they just don't want to stop because they don't want to lose all of that. And a simple piece of functionality would actually make a huge difference if they could pause.
I think the fact that they can't pause a game means that they're kind of stuck there, but it's a feature that sounds as though it's deliberately designed to stop you from, well, you know, taking a break, going to the toilet, getting something to eat. So that's something that's going to keep you there. But I was also going to ask about the concern over video game addiction has been around for years, hasn't it? I mean, Nintendo and things, it's been around since the 80s.
Space Invaders.
But then has something changed in recent years that perhaps makes it more addictive now than it used to be?
I think when we're thinking about video games addiction now, what we have to remember is that we're seeing a convergence of many different desires and rewards that come together in the experience of gameplay. And for me, there was a real step change when I was working with young people and they started moving from multiplayer games, which they could now play online with people around the world. Games like Halo, I think, were one of the first ones that came to my attention. And that was kind of exciting and buzzy. But when they started playing the massive multiplayer games, one then gets into large group or crowd experiences that I think amplify those trends even more. And the buzz of being part of something that's massive and online, I think is a significant part of what goes on. One only has to look at the phenomenon of Fortnite, which trended at a global level in the most massive way, and it to the point where one might be more worried about someone who wasn't playing it than the young people that were, because they were all swept along in some astonishing crowd-like process to be online and in-game for as much of the time as they could.
I suppose the other factor, the other point is that you don't need an expensive computer or a console to play games. We carry screens around in our pockets. You know, a lot of these video games start out for free, so really you can play anytime, anywhere. Does that build addiction by stealth? I
think as a principle, the more accessible something is, the more possible it is for problematic use and addiction to occur. We see it, say, with alcohol around the pricing of the alcohol, around licensing laws and when you can get hold of it. Now, when we migrate that to the world of technology, we're now in a world of internet everywhere. It's possible for a young person to move through their environment without ever being disconnected. They certainly won't switch their phone off. And devices are becoming cheaper. It's possible to buy a tablet almost for less than it would cost to take a family out for a day. And so, of course, with free games, low-price technology, public Wi-Fi, all sorts of factors, we're making it possible to keep on with those experiences, whether it's mobile gaming or something more sort of extensive. In fact, in a city like London, I've known gamers just living in parts of the city where they can hook onto public Wi-Fi. They don't even need a broadband connection in the home. And that's quite a challenge then to deal with.
But then again, how is gaming any different to the other parts of our modern interconnected lives? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the number of friends, the number of likes, the notifications. All this is just as addictive, isn't it?
I think we can see the similar sort of processes of addiction with social media in the way you describe. But there is something I think about the competitiveness that particularly comes with gaming that, again, may be one of those additional drivers to just give it that edge on social media in terms of keeping you wanting to go back, to improve your rank.
How then do you treat this type of addiction?
When we started out at Nightingale Hospital, the approach to treating a young person was often to start with a digital detox. I think the level of immersion was so great that it was very difficult for that young person to even think about a world beyond the game because they were so inside it and so compelled to keep playing. When we tried to do that offline as outpatients, there were sometimes extreme reactions, sometimes such agitation and aggression the police could be called, violence could erupt.
This is if it stopped, gaming is stopped altogether, you go cold turkey.
The cold turkey was extremely difficult for families to bear. The young person themselves might also become acutely distressed and panic and sometimes place themselves at risk of harm to themselves. And that was scary. And so the service was set up to provide a safe space to support people. But I was also learning from the families I was working with that sometimes they would do something spontaneous. They might involve other family members, almost have an intervention where they talked about how they were going to stop the access to the game or even the internet, which is often easier. And they would do something. Sometimes they would go for a holiday somewhere without internet. Sometimes they would go camping, something where the young person would then be immersed in all sorts of activities and sort of interesting things to do that didn't involve a laptop.
So does it work?
Well, that was the problem. It did. What I found was that the patients I was working with and their families were often coming back from those times.
But you can't be on holiday all the time. Or maybe you can, I don't know.
Well, the interesting thing is that once you take that step, you sort of wake up to the fact that something else is going on around you, and there actually might be some impact on your life. Perhaps you're missing friends that no longer come and knock to see whether you want to join them in a trip to the cinema or whatever, or that you realize that you're going to have to repeat your year at school because you've missed so much. And those sorts of impacts, of course, can drive you back into the game as if being aware of what you've lost is too painful. But with the right support, that readjustment enables a different conversation to start about how you might strike a different balance. Maybe for a while you can't game. You've just got too much to do, it's too risky.
But you were just describing some very extreme forms of behaviour when the player is separated from being able to do as they wish. Have you seen a role then for pharmaceutical intervention? Is that something that could happen? Do you ever prescribe drugs for this?
Back in the early days of my work, I did think gaming at times seemed to be associated with depression of mood, and on a few occasions prescribed antidepressants. I think somewhat to my shame later, I thought that a digital detox had a more powerful and beneficial impact on someone's mood. And for those that can undertake a prolonged period of perhaps even a month, the sort of recovery of the brain and improvement of the mood was so much better than anything I'd been able to achieve before, that it made me think, as we can see, if someone's abusing stimulant drugs, the brain just becomes exhausted. And if they take a break from that, the mood and the brain recover quite naturally.
Well, what then do you say to someone who might be watching this who has a family member who's spending too much time in front of a screen or a video game?
I think what any family should do is firstly not take a judgmental position. One of the first steps I would take today is to try and reduce the conflict about the gaming, because it's that level of heated argument and sometimes physical aggression that again often leads the young person to feel under no circumstances will they stop that activity. And so you sort of tap into the rebelliousness that might also be a driver in their gaming.
Let's turn to the question of responsibility. As artificial intelligence, virtual reality technology becomes more pervasive, what role do social media and gaming companies play in prevention of unhealthy behaviours?
I think for all developers of technology now, they need to embrace the possibility of unintended consequences, not to acknowledge for the purposes of litigation the need to sort of defend themselves against inappropriate complaints that the games or whatever technology has had adverse effects, but that we need to move towards a world of transparency and ethical design, which I know everyone's going to be anxious about, because of course all game designers, all producers of technology themselves are in a highly competitive arms race with each other, trying to produce those products that are going to be, I don't know, the Fortnite of the next season.
Well, this is exactly it. These companies design and build business models, applications, software to keep you there and to keep you there for as long as possible. That's not going to change.
I think if we continue to mine the business model that we perhaps drifted into some 10 years ago when the social media companies were looking at how to sustain their businesses, we have ended up in a world of persuasive design where keeping people on screen for as long as possible so they see those advertisements or they make those in-app purchases that again sustain the businesses. It's going to be exhausting of us all, but also of their business model. And so at some point there needs to be a reappraisal of how we sustain the good aspects of technology, maintaining the ethics that keep us able to think and able to live well.
Apple and Google recently came up with some new tools for managing screen time. You can check how often you looked at your phone after bedtime or how long you've spent on Instagram. Are these sort of technological changes a positive thing, or will they really not make much difference unless you self-regulate?
I think we need to go further. I think we need to embrace a model of digital well-being where we're starting to be a bit more precise about how we can use the technology in a way that enhances our health and well-being, or at least doesn't damage it, so that we can actually not just say it's fine to game or it's not fine to game, or use social media or not social media, but how to use it. And in that sense, I still think the research that Facebook commissioned from, I think, Michigan University about the use of social media last year was really helpful. So people who were just passively scrolling and kind of not deciding how they were using the social media, but kind of just going with the flow, seemed to have a more negative impact on their mood than those people that used it meaningfully to connect with the people that they wanted to and respond by posting. Now, of course, you could argue that Facebook is still saying you're using Facebook and that's a good thing. But I do think if we use it well, we could avoid a lot of these problems.
But would you say that there might be a need to go one step further? Is government intervention or legislation needed here?
I think if we seriously consider that industry is struggling in its ability to understand the unintended consequences of a business model that may once have been quite reasonable, of a level of global competition that is making everyone anxious and driven to keep going. And at this point, I think it's worth remembering that even a company like Netflix, where there's a subscription model, the CEO last year was still able to say that his competitor was your sleep. So being the biggest, the trillion-dollar company, whatever it is that is driving these companies, does need to be recognized for what it is. And if the users of services are paying the price for unbridled competition, then regulation to step in and ensure the sort of well-being of users, the safety of them, their happiness and future health, I think that's a good idea.
But perhaps that isn't something many of these companies are taking into consideration now. What about schools? What about education? What can be done there to raise awareness about the way we relate and interact with technology to say that it should happen in a smart and balanced way?
I think schools can do a great deal in terms of helping us have a positive relationship with technology. Establishing healthy habits early in life is a fantastic way of being able to support their maintenance later on. So getting it right as early as possible is a really good idea, and that's why I don't necessarily go along with the idea of no screen time under 2 years, because I think learning how to be on screen but also step off screen as early as possible and learning good habits and being able to manage that self-control is great. Schools can do a great deal. They can teach us about well-being. I know some schools teach their pupils now about sleep and about its sort of almost miraculous quality of being able to refresh and replenish the body and support happiness and all sorts of cognitive developments. I mean, I recently learnt, and I feel ashamed, that when you sleep well, you release growth hormone. You actually literally grow better when you sleep well. And so then looking at how social media or gaming can disrupt your sleep, I think young people who are always interested in neuroscience start to understand the why. Where they get frustrated is being told, don't do something without having any explanation. Head teachers in this country are also starting to support parents in setting a good bedtime sort of habit of no screen after a certain time, and they say to children when they start at their schools, they expect them to manage that. Some schools are running token systems where you have to earn a number of tokens to get time to play games like Fortnite. So there are lots and lots of ways that schools are starting to embrace that.
Looking to the future and the way video games might reshape our lives, you have realistic depictions of life in virtual reality. You have these immersive, complex, three-dimensional experiences going on. Will it be possible for those that choose to do so to live their life completely in a virtual reality without it being seen as negative or addictive, but something that does become normalized?
I think it's entirely possible that we will be conducting more and more of our lives in virtual spaces, and that gaming would certainly be one of those areas, especially if you were one of the sort of hugely successful pro gamers that was streaming their gameplay and making a fortune out of that. So I think we will be recognizing that games like offline sports of today or the Olympics might be a way that people succeed, and I'm sure we'll be seeing the equivalent of YouTube in virtual spaces too.
Dr. Richard Graham, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.